All right, cool. It looks like we're live. Hello, everybody. Welcome to yet another last minute stream. I really ought to start announcing these, but I'm a very spontaneous kind of guy. I don't like to organize or plan ahead. It's personality flaw, admittedly. It is a flaw of mine, but there are a couple of news stories that have come to mind. I recently read an article on the World Socialist Workers website, and it's basically talking about America and its meddling in the South China Sea. And the other story that we're going to talk about today is Rand Paul uh, on socialism. I keep getting recommendations on my channel of Forbes breaking news, and it is of Rand Paul or Ted Cruz or other right wing political demagogues that go on there to repeat the same dead stereotypical tropes that I'm very fucking sick of hearing about all the time. So I think what I'm going to go ahead and start with the spicier topic, because I feel like it would help retain viewer count a little bit better. So we're going to go ahead and start with that. We are going to address Rand Paul's whatever, but yeah. Hello, everybody. Hello, Ryzik. Greetings from the United States. Hello, comrade. So let's go ahead and get started, I guess. Here we are. Am I sharing the sound? I always forget to share the sound. Might be. You guys are probably going to hear this in double. Just a heads up. If you guys are getting a lot of reverb, actually, I'm going to mute my mic. Maybe I should mute my... Actually, I know what I'll do. We'll share screen, Chrome tab. Haven't read their history. There we go. Now we're talking. Now I can mute my mic so that you guys don't get reverb. Let's go ahead and get started. We'll speed it up a little bit, just for brevity's sake. I can't stream long, so...
How much money we're borrowing. We borrowed $3 trillion last year. We're going to borrow $5 trillion this year. People ask, is there a limit? Is there a limit to how much we can borrow? And I think there is. You want an example of good government? Look at your local government. Your local government spends what comes in. Now, you may wish they could spend it on more things, but your local judge, executive, your mayor, they can only spend what comes in. The federal government could learn some lessons from local government. Our problem is we think we have a printing press, we have the Federal Reserve, and we think we can just print up as much money as we want and just keep spending it. And that's what they're doing. But even before we got to all the madness of spending now, we were already $1 trillion short. If you add up Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, and military spending, the big five spending, it's $1 trillion more than comes in. And I tell people all the time, the responsible, reasonable thing you could do is spend a little bit less, not even dramatically less. If you spent 1% less across the board for most of the last 5 years, that would have balanced the budget within 5 years by spending.
Okay, so I want to talk about this tired old trope, this tired old meme of balancing the budget that Republicans are quite very much obsessed with. Whenever you have deficit hawks like Rand Paul or any of these other Republicans, they might pay lip service to how wasteful our overbloated military is on an absolute best case scenario, but they will never do anything about it. And under most cases, they will actually talk about how we need to beef up the military, make sure we have a nice, strong military. The reason why they get on the deficit and they talk about how America is running on a deficit is because it is a way for them to push and justify for the gutting of the commons. It is a way for them to basically sell the American public by harping on the debt, sell the American public on slicing away social benefits like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and what little social services we have here in the United States that haven't been totally fucking privatized. So that's like the real justification for this more than anything else. The truth is, when you have the world reserve currency, that is the dollar, when you have a world reserve currency, the deficit really doesn't fucking matter. Debt is kind of the lifeblood of capitalism anyways. It creates pressure, it drives people to work, and it stimulates economic activity by bringing future spending into the present. So debt's just kind of an inevitable thing that's just going to exist. And even then, no one's going to fucking collect on our debt, yo. Like, nobody's going to collect on our debt. What's going to happen? America borrows money from this bank or this country. I mean, it's not like we're going to ever face any consequences. No, it's the third world. It's the third world that suffers the consequences when they take on debt, because then they have to restructure their economy by liquidating their public sector and inviting foreign corporations in to dominate their labor and resources. But the United States, being the world reserve currency, we're not as restricted, and there's a much greater threshold by which we will experience inflation. We still are suffering from inflation, don't kid yourselves, but the reason why we can print trillions of dollars and hyperinflation doesn't kick in Weimar Republic style is because of the demand for the dollar. The dollar is traded with by countries all over the globe. It's the world reserve currency. So there's a substantially higher threshold by which we can print money, and it will lead to inflation. But we are having inflation right now due to a combination of labor shortage and, of course, because we've added, $14 trillion to the economy.
1% less. I tell people come up and everybody's got a good cause. Everybody wants the money to be spent on something good. So, for example, we often have a group coming up for Alzheimer's research. They'll either have a mother or a grandmother that has Alzheimer's. They're afraid they're going to get it, and they want research. And I'll look at them and I'll say, it's a good cause. And last year we spent $100 million on research, but we're out of money. Would you accept $99 million? Everybody's like, well, yeah, that's fairly reasonable. But you tell anybody in Washington that you're going to spend $99 million instead of $100 million, a 1% real cut in spending, they'll look at you like you have two heads. And it's a completely insane notion. And yet, anybody that's ever been in business, anybody ever in business where you had to cut back on what you spent the last year because business isn't going as well? What happens in our economy is if the economy's not doing well, they spend more money. So we really just have to get back to practical things that all of us know in our daily lives are real.
Stupid, fucking stupid. Do you people realize what would have happened if we restricted and scaled back all of our spending, if we didn't release any sort of stimulus whatsoever last year? Do you people fucking realize that our economy would have come to a grinding halt and crashed and completely fallen apart? Like, that's what these libertarian types don't understand. They don't understand that the reason why these bailouts occur is because the alternative is all these big financial juggernauts, all these big businesses and firms failing. When they fail, you end up with tens of millions of people that end up getting laid off, which creates which ends up creating a deflationary spiral, and you end up with mass unemployment, immiseration, poverty. So without the kind of government intervention that Rand Paul is paying lip service against, our economy would have fallen apart decades ago. And I mean, even doing what we're doing, there are still internal contradictions to that. I mean, basically what we're doing is perpetually bailing out the big banks on the tax dollar of the working class. It's really just the workers getting fleeced and hosed over and over again. And big corporations can take financial risks and they can gamble, on the stock market. That's really all it is. It's just gambling. So they can gamble, they can make all the money. And then whenever they're not making money anymore, we end up taking a fat load for it. And that is the current system as is. And that's how it's going. And that's how it's going to keep going until people wake up and smell the bullshit and decide to do something about it.
And that we have to have a budget. We have to do some budgeting. When I go back in September, though, the other side is going to spend $3.5 trillion. They spent $1.2 trillion before I left. They're going to spend another $3.5 trillion. It's going to be a lot of free things. They're going to say, well, childcare is free, and then community college is free. But has anybody ever really gotten anything for free? When you get something for free, when a telemarketer calls you on the phone at night and says, it's a $3,000 if you sign up for this, doesn't an alarm bell go off saying there's something not right about this?
This is a complete misrepresentation of the social democratic position. Now, you guys know me. I'm a communist. I'm not a liberal. I'm not a social democrat. But even I'm going to tell you that this is a misrepresentation. Anybody with even a rudimentary understanding of the political substance will tell you that they understand that it's not free. We know that it's not free. It's coming out of taxpayer dollars, but that is a preferable alternative to people not having those things available at the behest of the taxpayer, and instead we leave it up to private corporations, which have a profit motive in mind, that they're prioritizing the dollar, which as a consequence will lead to people getting fleeced for worse human services, fleeced for worst human services. America, we pay more per capita than any other country on the planet for our healthcare services. We get worse outcomes across the board, ranked 38th in the world in healthcare. We rank right behind Cuba, a sanctioned, broke-ass third world country which does have public healthcare. Yeah, they have a healthcare system that's comparable to ours, despite being a sanctioned third world country. So that goes to show like how fucking horrendous our healthcare system is. This is an embarrassment. This is a national embarrassment. I can't believe we are still having these conversations in fucking 2021. The bullshit that they have been spewing today is the same bullshit they've been fear-mongering about for decades, and it's done all in pursuit of keeping people from thinking deeper about these things. I'm telling you right now, anybody who's really like a right-winger or a Republican at this point is either blissfully unaware of the facts or they're just ideologically committed and they have a deeply vested interest in keeping the system going. And that's kind of how the cookie crumbles. When does he talk about socialism? None of this has anything to do with fucking socialism.
There's really nothing given to us in life. We only get to where we get, either through doing well in school or working hard or selling some product or being good at welding or being good at carpentry or being a physician. You get somewhere because you work hard and you provide service to people. But to tell people that they're going to get ahead by we're going to give you something for nothing, it's a lie. And ultimately, the lie rebounds on those least able to do something about it.
The only person that's lying right now is you, Rand Paul. The only person that is spreading falsehoods, I'm pretty confident is deliberately, is you by fucking misrepresenting the opposition's position. All right. Again, people understand this shit's not free. We understand it comes out of the state, but that's a preferable alternative to not having these things. I mean, fucking seriously, dude. Why does this have so many likes? Holy shit. I'm seeing a lot of dumb motherfuckers right here. My lord. Holy shit. Holy guacamole. There's a lot of dumbass motherfuckers out there. Dumbass motherfuckers.
So, for example, when we spend $5 trillion this year that we don't have, and they print up the money, what happens? Prices go up. You're going to get inflation. But who gets hit hardest by inflation? Somebody makes a lot of money or somebody makes a little bit of money. So it's the false promise. We tell people we don't have much money, we're going to give you money. But then when we give you the money, a year later, your price is rising. You're like, how come I'm not any richer? I got a check for $1,400, but the price of what I buy at the grocery store and gasoline and everything else is up $1,400. Sometimes it's worse than that. Sometimes the free stuff you get is actually less than that actually happens in inflation. And inflation is insidious. It goes on and on and on. Even before this big, huge rash of spending, over the last decade, they said the official estimate was 1.7% inflation a year. I'm like, well, that's not bad, 1.7%, but times 10, that's 17% for a decade. Are there people in America that didn't get a 17% increase in the last 10 years? Some.
Yeah, and we haven't seen commensurate rise in wages, hence why nobody's going back to work, and there is a silent labor strike going on. There is a silent general strike that the mainstream media is not talking about in the wake of this national labor shortage. And it's because people aren't going back to work, because they make just as good money on unemployment as they would working these bitch-ass jobs making like $10 to $12 an hour. This is a consequence of wages being suppressed for decades. This is the consequences of that because people are finally realizing that it is not within their interests to return to work. We still have a real unemployment floating at around 10%. Real unemployment, labor participation rates are about 60%, 65% right now. It's like pitifully low. And it's that way by design. So the other reason why inflation happens, it's not just because we print more money. That's not the reason why inflation occurs. It's because there's a rise in demand that production is not meeting commensurately. So you have industry produce, say, 100 widgets, that's the supply. Demand is 80 widgets. What does industry do? Prices go down. Market marks down so that they can sell more widgets. Conversely, industry produces 100 widgets. Consumers demand 120 widgets. What's going to happen? Prices go up. And when you give people all that money, they have all that money, which stimulates demand because people have more coin to spend. When they have more coin to spend, it stimulates demand. And that is what leads to inflation. It is the increased demand for goods that, isn't being met. So inflation is just going to be a constant thing within the context of capitalism, unless we live under socialism, where resource rationing is not done according to market pressures, because under socialism there wouldn't be any inflation. This is always going to be a thing, and as long as there's commensurate rise in wages, and as long as there are advances in the productive forces to meet increased demands due to stimulation by giving people more money to buy things, it's a non-issue. It's just short-sighted fuckheads don't see it that way. Instead, they'd rather people make less. I mean, if these people had things their way, we'd be living in feudalism right now. People would just be living in squalor. Be very happy that the likes of Rand and Ron Paul do not run this country. Because if they had things their way, we'd be living in fucking Mad Max right now. I'm not even fucking joking about that shit. We'd be living in Mad Max. It would just be, whole system falls apart, which would actually be kind of beneficial to us. Then we could all laugh at the Republicans when they ruin the country, and we can, agitate much more easily, because the contradictions are just so in your face that people have no choice but to rebel at that point.
Some made $32,000 or $28,000. They still made that day after day, year after year. And a decade later, that means you got 17%. So if you made 17% in 2000, let's say you made $30,000 in 2010, you make $30,000 today, you have the same amount of money? No, you have 17% less. But that comes because people in government or people running for office come and say, we'll give you this, but they didn't really give you anything. They borrowed it from you, they borrowed it from your kids, and they stole it from the value of your currency. There's so much of this going on that I'm alarmed at where we're going. We borrowed more in a shorter period of time than we ever have in our history. The ultimate is that there are actually people in our government now promising socialism. People say, oh, that's not true. Well, we've now elected people from the Democrat Socialist Party, the Democrat Socialism of America, AOC and the squad. They're members of the Socialist Party.
Yeah, so I don't know about that. I'm pretty sure AOC and the squad aren't members of the DSA. But I knew that this was going to come. Ultimately, it just comes down to red baiting and fear mongering. We've been taught for so long that the government doing any sort of intervention in the economy and doing anything resembling like rational economic activity to bail out the fucking ruling class, as they have over and over again, bailing out this failure of an economic system, is socialism. The Republicans basically are, for all intents and purposes, the most reactionary components of the dictatorship of capital. All right. AOC and the squad are watered down, milquetoast social democrats. They aren't these fucking, they aren't like hardcore communists. Like, basically the Republicans are going to call them communists no matter what they do. They were trying to, anyone remember the debate that Biden had with Trump? Trump was red baiting Biden. He was trying to say Biden was a socialist. Yes. Uphold Comrade Biden thought. I agree. Comrade Biden for office. Comrade Biden 2020. They will red bait and accuse the Democrats of being communists just for slightly raising taxes, even though the Democratic Party is a step to the left of the Republicans. And it's just a way to fearmonger and manipulate the base. That's all it is. It's the politics of fear. There's no rationale behind it. There's no rules, goals, or promises. There's no rationale behind it. It's literally just fear-based politics. You can't raise the taxes on the rich. You can't have a public healthcare system or state-owned enterprises. Otherwise, that's communism. And then Mustache Man bad, Mustache Man kill 500 million. This is the same type of dipshit that'll tell you Hitler was a socialist. I'm not fucking kidding. Rand Paul has said that Hitler was a socialist, which is not true at all, because Hitler's economic policy was much more in line with a Reagan or a Thatcher than it was with a Salvador Allende or Thomas Sankara.
To me, people said, oh, well, I'm not really a liberal, I'm a progressive. Now they're openly admitting they are socialists. My wife and I wrote a book about this. It's called The Case Against Socialism.
And people say, well, why do you have to write a book about socialism? Wasn't it debunked 100 years ago? Didn't Milton Friedman and, all the others, didn't they actually debunk? So they did. But if you interview young people right now, 50% of them say, oh, we ought to try socialism.
Yeah, because you're completely out of fucking touch. Young people want socialism because the system as we know it now is failing. And, they see what your alternative is to the status quo, which is basically fascism. And most people are turned off by that shit. Nobody wants to do your solution, Rand. Nobody wants to do fascism. Like, seriously. Like, because that's ultimately what the logical conclusion of your world outlook and your politics will directly take us to. Young people, the system isn't working for people within my age group and younger. So it makes complete fucking sense that service workers that are in their 20s and 30s who have had their futures and their lives sold out so that we can keep all the billionaires richer. They understand what's going on. They instinctually know what's going on. And the whole socialism failed trope is just a huge fucking meme, Huge fucking meme. And, right-wingers will always make this point. They'll always make the point about how the USSR and the Warsaw Pact is gone, how all the socialist countries are basically gone for the most part. There's only like 1, 2, maybe 3. There's only a handful of socialist countries left. There are very few of them left. And they'll say, oh, so it's been debunked, Even though it took, how many centuries for capitalism to emerge from feudalism? And it took how many thousands of years for slavery to finally go away? Funny thing about that, slavery is still around. There's more slaves in the world than ever before. But the point is that it is a developmental process. That's the way these things work. They don't see it as a developmental process. They just have this simplistic view of pass or failed. Yeah, well, while socialism was around before it was forced to fail by the Western powers, because that's what it was. It was basically forced to fail in a counter-revolution from above. Before it was forced to fail, it overwhelmingly provided way better living standards on average. And things, and they'll bring up the example of Venezuela. Fucking Venezuela is not even socialist. And their economy was doing fine until global oil prices tanked. And that's the problem, is that Venezuela depended too much on a single resource. They put all their eggs in one basket, and that's part of what's causing their economy to suffer, on top of the sanctions. And on top of some genuine policy errors that they're making. But the point is that system as is doesn't fucking work. It doesn't fucking work. So people instinctually want an alternative. And socialism, everything being state property, everything being public property, and running the economy according to a rational plan makes way more fucking sense than free market anarchy, where we let a bunch of basically the equivalent of meth heads, because that's what billionaires are. They're like meth heads. They literally can't control themselves. We let the equivalent of just a bunch of junkies and psychopaths run our economy into the ground over and over again, and we keep bailing them off on our tax time while they wreck the planet with their unsustainable industrial practices and immiserate the lives of countless millions of people around the globe. So under your system, Rand, 20 some odd million people perish from preventable poverty related causes. Under my system, there's actually a direct systematic effort to tackle and end that poverty. There is no such direct systematic effort to eliminate poverty under capitalism. Poverty alleviation and improvements of living standards is only tangentially related to the profit motive. But otherwise, socialism has then and can now provide better living standards. And I literally have scientific proof to demonstrate that fact.
Well, because we've tried socialism. They haven't read their history. Heard of Stalin? Have you ever heard of Hitler? People say, oh, Hitler wasn't a socialist. Well, his party was the National Socialist Workers' Party.
Yeah, whatever. Fuck you. You're an idiot. As for Stalin was not this uniquely evil historical figure. I have my criticisms of Stalin. I am critically a supporter of Stalin and the Soviet Union, but When I look at his regime, I don't really see anything uniquely evil about it. Like, yeah, there was a great deal of immiseration and there was a lot of death that occurred under Stalin, but what was going on under the czars, right? Life expectancy under czarist Russia was in the fucking 20s, people. But it consistently rose and basically doubled over the course of the Stalin administration. Things got dramatically better for the Soviet people under Stalin. So his economic policy was on point, you know? Like, there's plenty of criticism that you can make of Stalin, but again, like, his economic policy was on point, and he basically, his government turned Russia into a fucking superpower that saved the world from the Nazis, you know? And on the whole point, Hitler is a socialist. Yeah, no, whatever. Shut up, you're an idiot. You don't know what you're talking about.
Mao, 45 million people died from a famine created by the government.
Not even close. Not even close.
The government came and told the farmers they had to go build earthen dams instead of working the fields. And then they said they had to plant the crops closer. Then they said you had to dig down a meter and a half, 3 feet into the ground to plant the seeds. What kind of moron would do that? Well, governments do moronic things and people starve by the millions of people.
Yeah, and corporations don't do moronic things. Corporations and private firms don't sacrifice lives upon the altar of profit. You realize in the last 200 years, the majority of famines that have taken place, like in the last 200 years, have been within capitalist countries. You know that, right? Famines are taking place and going on to this day in capitalist countries. Like, there are still ongoing famines that kill millions of people every year. Not just that, but you've got like companies like Pfizer that were infected with the AIDS virus. And they had this medication, or they had this blood that was infected with the AIDS virus, and they knew they were infected with the AIDS virus. So what do? Instead of dumping their medication, they turn around and sell it in Europe because the cost of the lawsuits would have been less than, you know, what they would have made in Europe. So they did a calculated move. Or how about the facts that you have power companies that were shutting people down during the pandemic? What about the facts that America never did a proper lockdown, and as a result, we have 600, 700,000 excess deaths from COVID? The free market kills too, motherfucker. Capitalism kills too, motherfucker. Or, you know, I can bring up a shit ton of examples, but my point is that when these deaths occur because of market pressures and because of capitalism, it's much more difficult to pin the blame on anybody because because under socialism, you have a government that's managing the entire economy. You have a state-run economy. So you have someone to blame for when things go wrong, if things go wrong. So it's very clear and obvious who's at fault whenever there's wrongdoings. However, under capitalism, the violence, the structural violence and the excess death is hidden. It's not as obvious and plain to see because capitalism, you know, it's driven to maximize its own profits while externalizing the costs to run industry, the costs to reap massive profits and increase profits. Those social and environmental costs are just externalized. You know, we've got the enclosure of the commons, we've got early industrialization, we've got, you know, adventurous wars led by imperialist powers. These are all completely preventable excess deaths that can be attributed to capitalism due to the profit motive and the pressures of the market, but because of the system's propensity to externalize and blame others for its own faults and shortcomings, there's a propensity. People just don't make the connection. That's what I'm trying to say. People don't make the connection because capitalism as a system is very good at blaming other people and other things for its own faults and shortcomings. And it's that way by design. That's all I'm saying.
Why is that important? The head of Black Lives Matter, you may be excited about her because she just bought her $4th million home. And her last home, she's not really for a wall on our southern border, but there's kind of some riffraff getting around her house. So she's building a wall around her house to keep people away from her house. But the head of Black Lives Matter wrote a book last year, and there's an interview. A woman comes up to her, and it's a YouTube interview, and they said, "Oh, I loved your book. Your book was so good, it reminded me of Mao and of Mao's Little Red Book. In Mao's China, you were forced."
I love how he brings up the part where she owns a multi-million-dollar home. Like that's just that's supposed to be a jab. So, I mean, I personally think that if you're a socialist or you're an actual communist, and you make a lot of money, you should be using the bulk of that money to fight the capitalist system. Like, you shouldn't be using it to live like a member of the 1% because it jades your class interests and puts you out of touch with regular working people. And, but otherwise, I think the argument, like, the argument that right-wingers make that, oh, you claim to be a socialist and yet, you have a good paying job. It's so stupid. Like, it's just individualizing fucking people's activities because you participate in society. You're not allowed to criticize that society. It's so dumb, So hold on. You take issue with slavery, right? You don't like slavery. And yet you're wearing a t-shirt made by a slave down in Africa. Pretty ironic, huh?
To carry the book with you. He printed them by the billions, but you had to have them on you or they beat you. But the book was Marxism, socialism, the government owns everything. And it led to famine. But the head of Black Lives Matter is just giggling away saying, you get it. You understand the parallels between my book and Mao's Little Red Book.
That would be because Mao Zedong is not the monster that you think he was. All right? China was a country that suffered from cyclical famines for centuries. At the turn of the century, they had a devastating famine that killed tens of millions of people under the fucking colonial occupying reactionary government, all right? I don't hear you guys fucking concerned trolling about the evils of capitalism and the millions of deaths that occur. I mean, China was still semi-feudal, so I guess... But even then, like, you're not... So China, a famine-prone country, has one famine within the early years of socialism when it's still developing. The state makes mistakes. They have a famine. And then they never have another famine again. And now China's on the path to becoming the world's #1 superpower. And you're going to sit here and try to paint it out as a failure. Yeah, whatever. Bullshit. Fuck you. Totally narrow-minded. Totally small-minded. Whatever, dude.
So the head of Black Lives Matter is either ignorant of history or complicit with violence. There is no in between.
We are all complicit in violence with some way or another. The difference is that you stand with the 1% of the population that seeks to do and use any violence, terror, or manipulation possible to keep the rest of us in line and subjugated, while people within my ilk and my group want to use violence to defend the 99% against the 1%, My group wants to use the violence to take the power from the few and give it back to the many who created that power and wealth in the first place. So you think you're a fucking cuddly little cat, Rand Paul? You think you're so fucking sweet and above the fray? Let's look at Rand Paul's voting record. Let's see what Mr. Let's see his voting record. Hold on. Emergency Assistance Act. Oh, you're still on that screen. That's all right. I'll pull it up here in a second. Nominee, infrastructure investment, concurrent settling, United Innovation Competition. Damn, he votes no on a lot of shit. Joint resolution, nominal. Okay. Anyways, Secretary, Attorney General, Rescue Plan, prohibit funds made available under Title II states, local educational agencies, and institutions of higher. He voted against raising the minimum wage. So that's a form of violence. You're literally making people poorer. You're voting against. You're voting in favor of prohibiting funds to local and regional governments for educational services. That's a form of violence. You're depriving people of access to education. Or let's see what else we got here. National Defense Authorization Act for the fiscal year of 2021. You know, oh, he voted no against it. Well, anyways, point remains that free market kills too, motherfucker. Every ideology has blood on its hands. But the difference between yours and mine is, despite the shortcomings, mistakes, and crimes committed by communist governments, it is a drop in the bucket compared to the horrible, I mean the horrible shit. Like, open up a history book, people. If you actually read history and open up some history books and actually educate yourself in the history, you'll find that the United States and the Western governments are guilty of way worse atrocities and crimes against humanity than the fucking Soviets or Chinese ever were, you know? And again, it's not whataboutism. And the reason why it's not whataboutism is because people who bring this shit up are making the argument that communism's more violent, or communism's inherently violent, or it inherently leads to more death and suffering, when the complete fucking opposite is true. In virtually every instance when communism's been implemented, it has massively raised living standards. And in many of the instances that it failed, it was oftentimes forced to fail by the efforts of the Western colonial powers.
Can't be a fan of Mao, but here's the problem. You know who's giving money to Black Lives Matter? Coca-Cola, Major League Baseball, all the big corporations are donating money. You think, is this a conspiracy? Who's paying these rioters that are all over the country? They're staying in $1,000 hotels. They're on planes flying in to do rioting and to cause mayhem in our cities. Well, it's unfortunately, it's big corporations in America are all woke and they're all giving money to Black Lives Matter. But this isn't like the NAACP.
Oh shit! I love this other argument righties make. I love this other argument. Well, big corporations are backing Black Lives Matter, so this is therefore proof that communists are sponsored by the big bourgeoisie. You know, I love that argument. Because of how unbelievably unfucking true it is. BLM got almost immediately co-opted the second that it started to pose any real substantial threat. These corporations also lobby and pump money into police unions to crack down on these protests. What these corporations are doing is called a PR campaign. It is a PR campaign. It's virtue signaling. They're trying to market their brand by showing how woke and how fucking progressive they are. That's all it is. It's virtue signaling. That's why they're giving money to BLM, and that's why the Democrats have supported BLM. Ultimately, it ends up being co-opted, commodified, and recuperated into the establishment and neutralized so that it doesn't actually pose any significant threat. But no. Corporations are not left-wing. People who organize that big corporations are left-wing and back communists have lost the plot. If that's true, then why is it that they aren't lobbying to have communist politicians installed to nationalize their industry and implement economic planning and decommodification of goods? Why is it that they're doing the complete opposite of that? They're trying to commodify everything, turn everything into a market, deprive everyone of any sort of non-market support. I'm telling you right now, these corporations are much more in line with Rand Paul ideologically than you realize. Big corporations are just virtue signaling because it's a popular movement, and they're co-opting and reining it in because, you know, there's not really there's a lack of presence of left-wing, genuine left-wing communist organizing. But I'm telling you right now, when communists rise to the occasion, that's when you're going to see the claws come out. You know, once a movement, an organic movement arises, which is actually able to resist the establishment's ability to co-opt it and try to commodify it, you're going to see the state crack down. You're going to see the Republicans and Democrats coalesce and create legislation to crack down on that industry.
This isn't against racism. These are racists that you're giving the money to. These are people teaching that the black kids should sit on one side and the white kids sit on the other side, and we should tell all of them that the white kids are the oppressors. That's what they're wanting to teach in our schools.
No, they're not. You're full of shit. Fuck you. That's like straight up fucking lie.
People who are admittedly and openly fans of Mao Zedong, the guy who killed millions of people in China. When my wife and I were attacked by a mob in DC, it was all over the video. You can see it. We were afraid for our lives. The head of Black Lives Matter in Louisville, you know what she said? She said, I could see that they had fear in their eyes, and that's the way they need to live. That's the way I have to live. They should have to live that way too. Who would want that? I don't want Nancy. I don't agree with anything Nancy Pelosi or Biden's for. I don't want violence on them. I don't want them to live in fear. And it isn't really about the color of your skin. The people who attacked us were predominantly black, but the police officers who saved our lives were predominantly black. It's not about race. It's about right and wrong. Marauding and mayhem and throwing Molotov cocktails at the police. That's not what we want in our cities.
I do. Yeah, so I think I'm going to go ahead and end it here. Rand Paul, the reason why you got harassed by BLM protesters is because you're fundamentally an establishment stooge. Despite your preachings of your libertarian ideology, libertarianism is extremely homogenous with the status quo. There is genuine racial biases and bigoted issues that are ongoing to this day. It did not begin and end with the civil rights movement. And if we were to go back to the 1960s, you would have been making these exact same arguments against the civil rights movements. Like, don't make no mistake, Rand Paul would have been saying the exact same shit if he were alive 50 years ago and we were living in the civil rights era. He'd be making all the same arguments, all the same concern trolley bullshit. You know, these people think it ended with the civil rights movement, but there's still a fuck ton of issues that racial and ethnic minorities are facing in the United States, you know? And people are cathartically lashing out, rightfully so, because it's just been amalgamating for decades. It's just been an ongoing amalgamating process for decades. But anyways. Anywho. Let's go ahead and read this article. Shit, I've already gone for 40 minutes. Well, we'll read this article by WSWS. First, reminder, Barry Goldwater, the first libertarian Republican, opposed the civil rights movement on property rights. Thank you. Thank you. I was just saying this. Thank you for vindicating my point. Thank you. All right, so let's go ahead and read this article. News: America has sent weapons to our embassy in Taiwan. We have military presence in Taiwan. Why? Because it's a fucking base area for it's a base area for an attack on China. Now, in the coming decades, the South China Sea is going to be a strategic hardpoint because that's where a lot of trade passes through. All right. And the reason why, the whole point of the Uyghur situation, Hong Kong, the reason why every couple of years or every couple of months, you'll hear about, you know, the Uyghurs, or you'll hear about Hong Kong. Now you're going to hear about Taiwan, Taiwan's national sovereignty being threatened, even though it's a part of fucking China. The reason why you hear about these things is not because people genuinely care. They don't give a shit. All right. People in the group really don't give a shit. The only reason they're talking about it now is because they're being manipulated by the mainstream news that are fear mongering about the evil big red menace, because they're basically trying to galvanize the United States public towards a common enemy, you know, yellow man bad, a common enemy against China, by doing all this anti-Chinese propaganda to distract from all of the internal class contradictions here at home. And this article talks all about that. The United States is systematically working to provoke an escalation of tensions with China over Taiwan. On Wednesday, the Wall Street Journal reported that U.S. troops have been stationed in Taiwan, which China considers part of its territory, for over 1 year. The journal's revelations, which Chinese officials saw as being a semi-official announcement by the U.S. government, came amid the most dangerous standoff between the U.S. and China since the 1958 Taiwan Strait crisis. The U.S. Navy has been carrying out major war games near Taiwan, following the announcements of the alliance between Australia, UK, and the U.S., AUKUS. which includes providing Australia with nuclear-powered submarines. These developments followed by the revelation in March that the United States is in active discussions to station offensive missiles in the first island chain off the Chinese mainland, including Okinawa and Taiwan. In 1962, when the Soviet Union stationed missiles in Cuba, in response to America stationing missiles in Turkey, a sovereign country nearly 100 miles from Florida, the U.S. declared that the USSR must either remove the missiles or face war. Today, Washington is stationing troops and possibly offensive weapons on territory claimed by China, just minutes of flight time from China's most populous cities. You know, it's so crazy how America will just brazenly violate international law, like brazenly violate airspace with our spy planes and so on. We'll just completely violate and just walk all over and disrespect the sovereignty of these other foreign countries, just stepping all over them and doing these deliberate belligerent acts of aggression in an attempt to escalate tensions. But if they were to do anything that was even a tenth as bad as we do, like, anybody remember when Trump threatened to go to war with Iran because of a downed spy drone that was flying over their airspace? Anybody remember that? Yeah, we almost went to war with fucking Iran over a spy drone, and we ended up murdering Soleimani. We ended up murdering their top general, who was like considered a national hero in Iran. We ended up murdering Soleimani out of spite. It just goes to show the fragility of empire, the hypocrisy of empire, that the only way that America can sustain itself at this point is by just making enemies with other people, you know, giving us all a common enemy to fight against. It's basically fascism. It really is. We all, the workers, the owners, we must not fight. We must collaborate towards a common cause, towards a common enemy, you know? It's literally fascism repackaged. It's the same shit. The response in China gives a sense of the potentially massive consequences of the United States' actions. The Global Times, which speaks for dominant sections of the Chinese political establishment, called America's actions tantamount to an invasion. It's clear that the Biden administration is trying to goad China into some sort of response, provoking an incident that can be seized on to create a de facto state of war. The U.S. may not want a full-scale conflict involving nuclear weapons, but war has a logic of its own once provocation turns into an exchange of arms. What is behind these extraordinary reckless actions? There are certainly the geopolitical imperatives of American imperialism, and China has become a central target of U.S. war planning over the last decade. The military considerations, however, are not the only ones. A major factor is the U.S. domestic political crisis. 20 months into COVID-19, the United States social powder keg, more than 725,000 Americans have lost their lives to the pandemic. Prices are rapidly rising amid a widespread labor shortage. Workers and industries throughout the country are beginning to demand pay and benefits commensurate with the increased cost of living. These demands are coalescing into a nationwide strike movement. Despite the efforts of the corporatist unions to suppress all opposition in the working class, there have been strikes in recent weeks of Kellogg's cereal workers, nurses in the UK, distillery workers in Kentucky, and carpenters in Seattle. There is seething anger among auto and auto parts workers, who are rejecting contract after contract brought back to them by the unions. Over the past year and a half, the American ruling class, as it has implemented a policy of mass death, has handed itself trillions of dollars, inflating a massive stock market bubble that can be sustained only through the relentless increase in the exploitation of the working class. Throughout history, and particularly in the 20th century, governments have seen war as a means of enforcing national unity. In the face of mounting political opposition in 1967, historian Arnaud de Mer noted in an article, Domestic Causes of the First World War, quote, "During the decade, including the weeks immediately preceding July to August 1914, the European nations experienced more than routine political and social disturbances. Even Britain, that paradigm of order, change, and constitutionalism, was approaching the threshold of civil war." This growth of social tensions, Mayer noted, quote, inclined the governments to push military preparedness and diplomatic obduracy as part of their efforts to maintain a precarious domestic status quo. So today, under conditions of deepening social, political, and economic crisis, dominant sections of the American ruling class see a conflict with China as a mechanism for enforcing national unity, which means in practice suppressing and criminalizing domestic opposition. This view is spelled out in the Financial Times columnist Janan Ganesh in a February 21 column titled, America's Best Hope of Hanging Together is China. Ganesh concluded, without an external foe to rail against, the nation turns on itself, adding, only an external force can end the age of discord. In July 2019, the former intelligence officer and current transportation secretary Pete Buttigieg made clear that a common external enemy would serve as the basis for national unity and the battle at home. The new China challenges, quote, the new China challenge provides us with an opportunity to come together across the political divide, he said. Quote, at least half the battle is at home, unquote. The First and Second World Wars were accompanied by systematic censorship in the United States and the imprisonment of left-wing opponents of capitalism. In 1918, socialist Eugene Debs was sentenced to 10 years in prison for his opposition to World War I. In 1941, 18 members of the Trotskyist Socialist Workers' Party were sentenced under the Smith Act between 12 and 16 months in prison. More recently, the attack of September 11, 2001 were utilized to implement far-reaching attacks on democratic rights under the framework of War on Terror, the Patriot Act, Guantanamo Bay, domestic spying, and other measures aimed at erecting the apparatus of the police state. As the WSWS noted at the time, the ruling elite, quote, seized on the tragic events of September 11th to realize their political agenda at home, just as they are using them to launch a U.S. military intervention in the oil-rich Central Asia. And what has happened over the past 20 years? Social inequality has grown to new heights. The American ruling class, in the form of plots of Trump, has raised the prospect of a fascist dictatorship. The criminality of the oligarchy under both the Democrats and Republicans has just led to a level of death from the pandemic that is staggering, and the working class must be on alert. The pandemic has made clear that the American ruling class is capable of sacrificing hundreds of thousands of lives to achieve its goals. If the deaths of millions of people in war is the, quote, least bad of several unfavorable options for the ruling class, these deaths will be tolerated. All over the world, workers are entering into struggle to demand the end of decades of falling or stagnant wages, horrendous and worsening working conditions, and an end to the pandemic. These struggles must be connected to the fight against imperialist war, the plots against democratic rights, and opposition to the entire capitalist system. Okay, so there are a lot of reasons why we want to escalate with China, all right? And among them is unifying the country against a common enemy. U.S. media and State Department has been pushing out a lot of propaganda over the last few years against China, you know. A lot of propaganda, and it's mainly to build resentment, fear, and hatred for them. But what our task is to do, what we should do, is prioritize anti-war efforts. Undermine the war machine as much as possible, and collaborate and work with the workers that are striking, the workers that are protesting, and just organizing locally. Unfortunately, we're not at a stage where we can really challenge the system, so what we need to do is organize and just get active at a local level for now, and hopefully down the line coalesce into something that's actually more substantial. But otherwise, none of us should really be surprised by this. None of us should really be surprised at all. The political situation in the United States is starting to get rather dire. We're starting to see an eruption of class struggle and class consciousness that has not been witnessed in decades. There is a passive, quiet general strike that is going on. People just aren't working. They aren't going to work. We have a national labor shortage. We are having a lot of economic problems, widespread inflation, and it's only going to continue to get worse and worse. America is actually suffering from a great deal of internal pressure right now. And I mean, it really does just go to show that for all this talk of American patriotism and so on, when I see America, I hardly see a country. I more see like a series of colonial states cobbled together, ruled by the military industrial complex and the financial oligarchy. You can hardly really even call it it's a regime. That's really what it was. It was a regime. You know, that's what it is. It's a fucking regime. And we're in need of a new regime. All right. A new regime. With all the wealth and resources this country has stockpiled, we could solve so many problems. Like, I'm telling you guys right now, we could end hunger, end sickness, massively raise living standards. People don't realize it yet, but we actually do have a lot to gain from socialism. So, they're going to do everything they can. They're going to do what they've always done: divide and conquer, fearmonger, scaremonger, just fear the other, otherization of other nations and other peoples. Like, they thrive on that xenophobia. They want you to be xenophobic. They want you to fear, despise these other nations and think of them as like these evil shithole countries, to paint them in the most negative light as humanly possible so that they can get the public complicit in the wide-scale mass slaughter and murder, And, I mean, if they're successful, organizing will make our jobs even easier because nobody wants war. And what happened? What was the last thing that happened? When was the last time we had a world war? And what was the last thing that happened in the wake of that war? We saw the birth of new socialist governments. We had World War II, even more socialist governments. The division and instability brought by war leads to the redrawing and the carving up of the borders, the establishment of new regimes, and the collapse of old regimes. And when I see America, I see a country that's coming, and not quite on its last legs, but it's very clear and obvious that America is an empire in decline. The age of U.S. imperialism is in its twilight. Back at home, we're suffering from massive amounts of strife and contradictions, opioid crisis, fentanyl crisis, massive amounts of people in our jails and our prisons. We've got crime, violence, suicidality, massive widespread social alienation, huge amounts of just political apathy, child marriage. We've got debt bondage out the wazoo, unemployment, rising wages, or rising inflation, stagnating wages. We've got a for-profit healthcare system that wants us dead. We've got a Republican Party that wants us dead. We've got all these internal strife and contradictions at home that are just compounding onto one another. And meanwhile, across the shores around every country, we are slowly losing our influence. The EU is now beginning to turn their back on us. We can't even pull off successful coups anymore. We've been failing in all of our coups d'etats. We can't even pull off successful coups anymore. That is the testament to how much we're declining as an empire. China's on the rise. America's slowly losing its grip on the world. It's only a matter of time before the military-industrial complex goes into remission and we end up giving up our overbloated military. And I have a feeling when America goes to war with either China or Iran, when it does, this country is going to get its shit pushed in very fucking hard, very fucking fast, because China and Iran are way more well-equipped. Even though we have an advanced military, we have an advanced military full of people that are in it for purely cynical reasons, It is much, much more difficult to rally people behind a cause of offense versus a cause of national defense. The Millennium Falcon simulation, which simulated what a theoretical war with Iran would look like, showcased that the United States would lose the war within the first few days. We would lose several super carriers, would get sunk. Tens of thousands of our troops would be dead. Our fleet would just be annihilated by the Iranian offensive within the first few days. That's what the outcome of the theoretical war simulation was. And in war with China, We don't have the missile systems that we used to. We don't have the means that we used to wage a war, especially against China, a country that has the numbers, the manufacturing, the industry, with a much more well-organized, tightly knit, and efficient political structure and command structure than ours. So if we went to war with China, AUKUS would straight up get crushed. I'm telling you guys right now, China would fucking win that war. We would very quickly lose a war with China, and the losses would be devastating. Paul Cockshot made a video about it recently. It's very, very informative, but he talks about the details as to why a war in the South China Sea would be bad news for the United States. Sounds like the proper conditions for revolution. What are you going to do about it? Let the masses know. I mean, there's not much we can do at this point because American masses, I mean, there's something resembling class consciousness growing, but we don't have the information infrastructure in place to reach people. Like, people are just incredibly fucking backwards. That's really the main problem. And until we can overcome the decades of brainwashing, social engineering, atomization, and political backwardness that is clutching so many people, I mean, until we can overcome and figure out a way to fight it and undo it, I mean, we're talking about an insurmountable task of proportions never before witnessed in history, you know? I mean, really, there's not too much we can do besides try to organize at a local level, support workers at a local level, and just focus on local organizing, you know? People always talk about communist parties, join this party, join that party, you know? We're not even at a stage where any of these little tiny balkanized, decentral parties can pose any sort of meaningful threat. So we should just focus on the conditions locally and what we can do locally to further the dialectic of socialism. Anywho, I gotta head out. You all have a nice day. I hope this is